I wrote a short paper for this where I concentrated on some work I've been doing lately on Keynes's ideas on wage determination. And as you know, in the general theory, Keynes he had this issue where he wanted to have some sort of stickiness in money wages, and which was a crucial part of his system. As it happened, he didn't devote a lot of attention to this, to the determinants of this wage issue. The main attention in the general theory is on aggregate demand, and then in the papers that, in his discussions around the general theory, and his writing his letters to other people and so on, his correspondence, I mean, the main message is aggregate demand is important, you must remember aggregate demand is important, and on he went, and that involved the monetary system in terms of liquidity preference and so on. So that was the main emphasis, and there wasn't a lot of attention. But early on in the general theory, he talks about wage determination, money wage determination. And he says, well, of course, what people are concerned about, workers are concerned about, is relative wages. And so he put forward this idea of relativities. Now, in behavioural economics, one of the major concerns of behavioural economics is relativities, reference levels, comparisons. Behavioural economics points out that people, they really hate to fall behind other people, and that they have some urge to get ahead of people. There's a nice cartoon of a worker approaching the manager and saying, well, if you can't give me a pay rise, why can't you give Smith over there a pay cut? And I suppose this is the sort of power of relativities. So Keynes had this idea that relativities were important, and he talked about it as the psychology of the work, as he mentioned psychology. He didn't follow this up much in the general theory or in his subsequent writings, as I said. And I think the reason is because he was very sceptical about the current state in 1936 of psychology. He made statements, well, psychology, it doesn't really admit of general answers to these questions. This was taken up a bit more by his disciple, Joan Robinson, who wrote at the same time and was very closely connected with the the generation of the general theory. And she also talks a bit about how psychology, well, they just haven't got their act together, basically, in terms of our language. They haven't worked out any good laws and so on that we can apply to wage determination. Now, of course, subsequently, psychology has been applied more rigorously to economic thinking, and in particular the contribution of Kahneman and Tversky in 1979, where they introduced their prospect theory. And in their prospect theory, these relative comparisons play a central role, and people are concerned about their outcomes relative to some reference level. It's interesting also that in their contribution in 1979, they introduced a concept called loss aversion. Loss aversion is to do with the fact that if we get ahead of someone else, well, that's okay. If we fall behind someone that we think we should not have done, we're really outraged. And so that losses weigh very hard in people's minds. And I think people who've, say, had any sort of managerial position, like being head of department, will know about how employees get absolutely irate about the slightest diminution in their conditions, and if you said to one of your employees, well, we're a bit short of money, and I've decided someone's got to have a pay cut, and it's you. I mean, they would, be outraged. Okay, beyond all measure, I think that would be justified in neoclassical economics. So this loss aversion plays quite an important role in this Kahneman and Tversky. Now, coming back to Keynes. Keynes's theory as such, with just his emphasis on relativities, is not actually sufficient to generate his rigid wages, and it wouldn't be sufficient to generate his model in terms of as he expounded it in the general theory. Because if you're not outraged by these wage cuts, then things start to get a bit more complex, and you can sort of whittle away at a wage level, and so things cease to be so cut and dried in the Keynesian sense of some stickiness. On the other hand, if you introduce this Kahneman and Tversky notion of loss aversion, then that explains very well why then workers would resist a wage cut. Now, having said that, it is quite interesting that Keynes, I think, recognised implicitly or intuitively the idea of loss aversion when he said, oh yes, here we are. Keynes made this statement in the General Theory: every trade union will put up some resistance to a cut in money wages, however small. Now this is an idea, therefore, therefore you resist even a tiny, tiny cut in money wages, which is suggestive of some sort of discontinuity in preferences, and therefore, in my view, would be some idea of reference of loss aversion. Therefore, I think if Kahneman and Tversky had written their article in 1929 instead of 1979, if they were 50 years earlier, I think Keynes would have been delighted, and this would have played a larger role. I'll say one last thing, though, because I see Peter Johnson here, and I remember what you said a bit earlier about wage flexibility and wage adjustment. There's another aspect of Keynes' general theory which I think is misleading, because it sort of comes over as a bit of an inconsistency. In his talk about the theory, he talks about rigid wages. Workers wouldn't accept a wage cut. But in this discussion of what actually happens in an economy, and then he's talking in 1930s about the experience in Britain and in other economies. I mean, as I understand it, he had quite wide experience. He was a fairly, he follows statistics quite broadly. So in his discussion, he noted that in fact wages do fall. But what happens is that a negative shock comes along, wages fall, but they settle at some sort of level. In other words, there's an initial decline in wages, and then they settle at a particular level. So in his discussion, you get this flex element and then a fix element. So it's more complicated. Okay. Now his theorizing doesn't explain this. However, again, the Kahneman and Tversky prospect theory, you can elaborate on that, and you can generate from that a theoretical explanation of why workers would in fact accept wage cuts. The way it would go is the following, and I suppose this is quite interesting in terms of current events. I'm not going on too long, am I? Okay. So let me see how I should. Oh, wait. We see at the moment, indeed, as we sit here, we see that General Motors are in negotiation with their trade union. Chrysler, they had a wage cut. You might remember a few years before that the airlines in America, there was at least one and maybe two or three airlines that got into trouble and they had agreed wage cuts with their workers. More systematically, Truman Bewley of Yale University, he's done intensive surveys of managers and union leaders and industrial relations people, a number of companies in the United States. And the interesting thing he finds is, on the one hand, that companies, they say, yes, it's disastrous to cut wages because it's bad for morale. Workers hate wage cuts. We never cut wages, except when the company's in trouble. And if the company's in trouble, like if Chrysler's on the verge, or GM, well, they're all on the verge, I suppose. if a company's on the verge of bankruptcy, and if they can make this credible to the workers, and according to Bewley, these situations turn out that they can be made credible, because of course you've always got the problem of the greedy employer. You can imagine Trinity would say to its tutors, well, times are tough, and so we've got to cut wages. But apart from that, it seems that but obviously that in practice is a particular problem. And so let me see. So in other words, this loss aversion resistance to wage cuts, it can be overturned when in fact you have this extreme stress, when firms are under financial duress. In that, the statistics support the idea that wage cuts will be made. And indeed, if you in Australia, there was large wage cuts in the 1930s, a 10% across the board wage cut. There was some resistance from unions, but I understand from my colleague Joe Isaac that this resistance was not like do or die resistance. It is the case in the United States that there was a big fall in money wages in the early 1930s, and in other countries as well. It's also the case that if you look at the 1980s recession and the 1990s recession, what you observe is that when the recession hits the economy, there's a big decrease in the rate of inflation, but when unemployment stops increasing, then the rate of inflation tends to revert to some sort of expected rate of inflation, which, say, for Australia in the 1980s happened to be about sort of 7-8%. And then, interestingly enough, in the 1990s, when it all stopped, it reverted. The expected rate of inflation had dropped for some reason or other to 2 or 3%. So you get this sort of flex fix. You see, you get this. The shock hits the economy, and this causes reductions in money wages relative to expectations. But then, as unemployment stops rising, then things settle down and there's no more downward pressure on wages. So like in this coming year, 2009, we're going to observe in Australia an increase in the unemployment rate, and we will observe, in my view, my prediction, if maybe I'll be wrong, but my prediction is, and I think if Keynes was here, he'd say, you're right here, Ian. I think we will observe a reduction in wages relative to what they were, and wage inflation could even get negative. We noticed, for example, in the last quarter of the CPI for last year, the CPI growth was negative, sort of reflecting this negative impact of fears of, in that case, of decreasing demand. But then unemployment will stop increasing. I suppose I sort of tended to take the view that this year it's going to stop increasing at the end of the year, but I notice a few comments around here that suggest that that's rather optimistic. Well, anyway, that's not my sort of area of knowledge. So, but once unemployment stops decreasing, then the wage inflation will stop decreasing, and then it will revert to its to some sort of expected rate, expected level. Okay, so anyway, the main message of what I'm saying is that Keynes would have been, therefore, a behavioural economist these days. He would have been keen on this prospect theory. I suppose just as a sort of an addendum, the other areas in Keynes's work where this sort of psychology comes in, I guess, is in terms of these animal spirits, and that's a very interesting question as to exactly what it is that these animal spirits he thought were trying to capture, or what they do try to capture. I saw that there was a nice there's a satirical magazine in Australia called The Onion. And they had apparently a lovely headline where it said, the public demand new bubble to invest in. And I think that perhaps that's what the manipulation of... One wonders, therefore, about the manipulation of animal spirits, and there's obviously... One has to be pretty careful about all that. So animal spirits are of another thing, and what did I say here? Oh, I see. Then there's this stuff about bubbles, which seems to be quite important, and stock exchange bubbles, which is an affront to sort of standard economic thinking, but it's quite interesting. These experimental economists, part behavioural economics, they can put some students in a laboratory, they can give them an asset that's worth $1, and they get them trading, and the students know the asset is only worth $1, but the price goes up and up and up, $1.50, $2, $2.50, it's only worth $1, yes, we know, and we're trading away, up and up and up it goes, and then, poof, and it collapses down back to $1, and they can generate these bubbles, it seems, with fairly easily, which is kind of interesting. And so maybe the economy is a bit bubble prone, which might have something to do with animal spirits. Myself, I think there's a concept in, and this is the last thing I'll say, but myself, I think there's a concept in the behavioural economics called self-serving bias, which I think is quite important in this financial shenanigans that we've had. I think these people well, we're all the same, not these people. I think we're all like this, where we sort of, when things are going pretty well, you know, we start to sort of think, well, it's our skill that's making these things go well. And I think people then can get into a situation where they downplay the negatives, you know, and they see themselves in a very positive light. Like, you know, 90% of people think they're above average at driving. 90% of people think they're above average at administration. No doubt 90% of people think they're above average at making money in the stock market. And so on it goes. And I think this self-serving bias is a very interesting issue, and that is perhaps related, I think, to Keynes' animal spirits. But I don't know a lot about Keynes' animal spirits, so I better not say any more, except to say I do think that Keynes nowadays would be a behavioural economist.